Hello, the title of this lecture is The Scopes Trials. 20th century fundamentalists mostly focused on soul winning and defending a literal understanding of the Bible. In time, however, fundamentalists were drawn into politics. From the end of World War I to the Scopes trial of 1925, fundamentalist leaders felt the need to engage in issues that they believed hurt American society. An early sign of fundamentalists showing greater interest in politics was the reaction to military events in the Middle East during World War I. At prophetic conferences where fundamentalists gathered, news of the capture of Jerusalem by the British garnered much interest. There was a rise in excitement that this development, quote, cleared the path for the fulfillment of the predicted return of the Jews to Palestine, end of quote. Such excitement foreshadowed very different views on how liberal Christians and fundamental Christians would interpret American-Israeli relations 30 years later with the rebirth of Israel in 1948. The rise of revolutionary socialism also compelled some fundamentalists to be more political. In the wake of the Russian Revolution of 1917, Bolshevik leaders murdered many Russian citizens not compliant to socialist policies. After World War I, there was a Red Scare in America when socialist leaders organized labor strikes that became violent. In the fundamentalist publication, The King's Business, a June 1919 illustration showed a cloud of Bolshevism and a pack of wolves bearing down on a man behind a fence with labels such as higher criticism and social service. In capital letters, the key question was, will this fence hold them back? As Arnold Gabelin saw it, revolutionary socialism revealed, quote, the full power of the God of this age, Satan, end of quote. In 1999, 80 years after Gabelin's words, the Harvard University Press published the Black Book of Communism that detailed the horror of revolutionary socialism that resulted in the death of 75 million people throughout the 20th century. Liberals did not show the same degree of concern for socialism as did the fundamentalists. Liberals increasingly viewed fundamentalists as a misguided group who failed to see the wisdom of a post-millennial view and evidence of world progress. Fundamentalists argued that it was a false liberal doctrine that was behind societal chaos. The gap between conservatives and liberals became more obvious with the rise of separatist movements and groups. For example, the formation of the World Christians Fundamentals Association was one such group organized to expose the false doctrine of modernism. Its first conference was in May of 1919. Also, we see some Baptists from the Northern Baptist Convention put together a fundamentals conference to clarify how far liberals had strayed from orthodox theology. Fundamentalists and liberals lined up on opposing sides on many other issues, including America's position on the League of Nations. The League of Nations came out of World War I consistent with the thinking of a new era of world politics. The foundation of the League was President Woodrow Wilson's idealism that was expressed in his 14 points. At the Treaty of Paris, or Versailles, Wilson had high hopes for his visionary idea of a League of Nations for solving international disputes peacefully. But he was unable to get the necessary support from Congress. After Republicans failed to support American entry into the League of Nations, Wilson campaigned across the country to promote the Treaty of Versailles and his pro-League measure, telling the American people that opponents of the treaty were traitors to humanity. Halfway in his 8,000-mile speaking tour, Wilson collapsed and a few days later, quote, suffered a life-threatening stroke that paralyzed the left side of his body and made him a virtual invalid, end of quote. Against Democratic James Cox, who supported the League, Republican Warren Harding won the presidential election of 1920. The following year, the United States officially ended war with Germany by signing the Treaty of Berlin. It was the Versailles Treaty minus acceptance of the League of Nations. The League would go on, but it would stand without the United States as a member. One notable feature was the Permanent Court of International Justice, known as the World Court, located in Geneva, Switzerland. Liberal Christians and fundamentalists differed on support for the League of Nations. Fundamentalists and liberals had already fought battles on church issues, but this issue was fought in the political arena. Dispensational premillennialists were the most passionate opponents to the League of Nations. They opposed international organizations, and thus their opposition was consistent with their history of anti-internationalism. During the war, leading dispensationalists condemned international peacekeeping schemes. In 1919, dispensationalist editor Arno Gabelin wrote that such international schemes portrayed, quote, the great delusion that man, by his power, by using his resources, financial and otherwise, will exceed in making the world better and finding a way out of the terrible conditions that the race is now facing in every direction, end of quote. Dispensationalists desired for people to rely on Christ and the Christian plan of salvation rather than relying on a secular organization, in particular a secular world organization. The support that liberal Christians gave to the League confirmed to fundamentalists that the idea was a bad one. Fundamentalists traced the League to modernist liberal theology. Dispensationalists were on guard for the emergence of an anti-Christian world empire. Other fundamentalists, likewise, were suspicious of claims that there could be world peace by way of mankind's efforts and organizations. The redemption of nations was possible before the return of Christ. Was impossible before the return of Christ and the ushering in of the millennium. So premillennialists and the dispensationalists within premillennialists believed that it was the only time that mankind would see peace would be with the return of Christ. Fundamentalists found other problems with the idea of the League. Some assailed the League of Nations as, quote, an unnatural yoke fellowship between Christians on the one hand and Muslims, Confucians, and Buddhists on the other, end of quote. Fundamentalists asked, could God bless an organization whose members included populations that practice idolatry and defied God's law? Dispensationalists fought against American membership in the League of Nations, even though it contradicted their avoidance of political activism. As one historian explains, dispensationalists felt duty-bound to arouse awareness that the League in as many people as possible, because they deemed it sinful to assist the coming of the Antichrist and his League in any way. James M. Gray, future president of the Moody Bible Institute, used his editorials in the Christian Worker magazine to urge all Christians to read the anti-League literature of the League for the preservation of American independence. This was it was actually the main publicity organization of the opposition camp. So the League for the Preservation of American Independence was one group that opposed the League of Nations. Now, as it turns out, the United States did not join the League of Nations, as we know. Some view this as the first major political victory for fundamentalists. One historian argues that the victory encouraged fundamentalists of the possibilities of using secular politics for religious ends. Despite this political victory, fundamentalists were mostly on the defensive since they were on the margins of their denominational and interdenominational structures. Virtually every Protestant denomination had showed support for the League of Nations. The liberal Federal Council of the Churches of Christ not only endorsed the League, but also pressured recalcitrant politicians to support the League. Established in 1908, the Federal Council of the Churches of Christ represented 33 Protestant denominations at its beginning and was known for its social activism. Its increasing adoption of modernist theology was a red flag in the eyes of the fundamentalists. The League of Nations demonstrated the power that liberal Protestants continue to exercise on the ecclesiastical level. Quote, for the dispensationalists, the prevention of increasing apostasy and of the eventual emergence of the anti-Christian world empire prefigured in the League was doctrinally impossible. So there, again, what we see with these fundamentalists are taking a very pessimistic worldview, a pessimistic view on what was going to unfold in the world, political, social, or whatever be the case. Nevertheless, fundamentalists were ready to confront liberal forces they saw as apostate. Fundamentalists also saw a problem with modernist education. It was the teaching of Darwinism in the schools that expanded political engagement by fundamentalists. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, despite the publications by Charles Darwin, most Americans believed in the divine creation of mankind. Much of the early debates concerning Darwin were confined to scholarly circles. When these debates spilled over into the public arena, fundamentalists responded with concern. Many equated Darwinism with atheism. Premillennialists especially were critical of evolutionary thinking. In the late 19th century, the very popular evangelist D.L. Moody had little patience for scientists who, quote, dug up old carcasses to make them testify against God, end of quote. Despite such concern, Bible teachers viewed higher criticism and the treatment of the Bible more as a historical document than as God's inspired word as the greater threat. For example, the fundamentals, that project by 64 Bible teachers, authors, that took place in between the years 1910 and 1915. We had these 64 authors write on and defending orthodox Christianity. What we see is that among this body of literature, which resulted in a 12-volume set, there was little attention to the evolutionary cause. So in the early period, then, far greater concern was higher criticism rather than evolutionary science. There was some flexibility in thinking of biblical literalists. From their reading of Genesis, they had identified two separate creations. The first creation of in the beginning, an unknown number of 1,000,000 years ago, and there was a second creation that took place in 6 actual days, approximately 6,000 years ago. Old fossils, thus, were from the first creation. This so-called gap theory was sanctioned in the Scofield Reference Bible of 1909. If the issue of Darwinism did not cause too much anxiety in the early period, the 1920s was a much different story. And I want to want to, clarify that certainly there were a significant number of people that actually were concerned about evolutionary science back in the late 1800s. Is certainly, when we're referring to right after the publication of the Descent of Man and so we're looking at the 1870s. There was concern, but historians tend to take the point that of greater concern was higher criticism, but there's always going to be exceptions. Now the 1920s very different. This decade witnessed fundamentalist confrontation that resulted in religious upheaval of major proportions. And a lot of it was at the doorstep of this whole Darwinism episode. In his 1922 sermon, liberal Baptist preacher Harry Emerson Fosdick asks, "Shall the fundamentalists win?" Conservative Presbyterian Clarence McCartney responded with, "Shall unbelief win?" So we have, again, the liberals and conservatives lining up, opposing each other. The liberals worried about the fundamentalists taking control of the various Protestant leadership, and vice versa. We have the fundamentalists very much concerned about modernists taking the reins of power in the various denominations, and really worried about what they believe is false doctrine. This modernism, also referred to as the new theology. Much of it, questioning the literal interpretation of the Bible, the inerrancy of the Bible. Well, what followed was that almost all the large Protestant denominations experienced some sort of disruption. However, it is the monkey trial of 1925 that continues to capture the attention of many. This is an incident that is discussed, certainly a part of all American history textbooks. And from my perspective, my interpretation of what took place, I draw on a fair number of different sources, but I found really quite helpful and insightful study by L. Marvin Wood titled "The Monkey Trial Myth: Popular Culture Representations of the Scopes Trial." Well, this is what took place. In 1925, the state of Tennessee, the Tennessee legislation passed a bill that made it unlawful to teach the theory of evolution. Now, such a law was not uncommon in the United States. This is something that other states had in place as far as the law. The American Civil Liberties Union, which I refer to as the ACLU, advertised in Tennessee newspapers, quote, for a teacher, to volunteer as a defendant in a test case to challenge the law. A businessman in the small town of Dayton saw this issue as a publicity opportunity to boost the town's economy. Now, others agreed. The next step was to approach a high school biology teacher to present the theory of evolution. But the biology teacher that they had targeted, that they had hoped would cooperate, did not. He actually refused. So John Thomas Scopes, not a biology teacher, but a physics teacher, he accepted the challenge. He substituted for the biology teacher, and it was him who taught a class on the theory of evolution. There was a formal arrest, and the ACLU began its case with Clarence Darrow as the defending lawyer. Now, Darrow was well known in America. He was one of the leading lawyers. Certainly, he had a national reputation. Particularly, Darrow was famous for successfully defending the lives of two cold-blooded child killers in the Leopold and Loeb trial of 1924. So just the year before. The ACLU also supplied two other eminent lawyers of the day. Now, they desired to show the superiority of modern thinking, contrast to biblical thinking, by introducing expert scientific testimony. The defense hoped to use the trial to prove the theory of evolution before the courts and the American people. The judge, however, had a different idea. Well, the judge ruled that Scopes was on trial, not science and religion. Representing the Tennessee law was William Jennings Bryan. He was the politician who had run for president 3 times without success. Bryan was a Presbyterian who championed Christianity as a force of good in civilization. A foe of evolutionism, Bryan volunteered his services to the prosecution. Even though he was not in the best shape, he suffered from diabetes and he was actually in quite poor health. Now, a little bit about Bryan. For about the previous 10 years, Bryan had become increasingly worried about the negative influence of evolutionary thinking. The 1916 book, Belief in God and Immorality, gave him statistical evidence that, quote, college attendance endangered traditional religious beliefs, end of quote. Bryan's wife reported that he became, quote, convinced that the teaching of evolution as a fact instead of as a theory caused the students to lose faith in the Bible, first in the story of creation and later in other doctrines which underlie the Christian religion, end of quote. Another troubling issue for Bryan was that he believed there was a linkage between Darwin's biology and German militarism that brought on the Great War. During World War I, Bryan saw the dark side of human nature, and he blamed evolutionary ideas. Bryan was no Bible scholar, certainly not anywhere near in the league of the Bible scholars who were a part of the Fundamentalist project. And he himself did not play any role in the formation of fundamentalists. In fact, in 1919, he stated that the Liberal Federal Council of Churches was, quote, the greatest religious organization in our nation, end of quote. However, he did oppose evolution, which he thought threatened social reform. In his view, quote, evolution limited social reform to a slow, gradual process that man could not effect. The doctrine of the survival of the fittest and gradual improvement he saw as paralyzing individual Christian action and the application of Christian principles to all aspects of society. These are the wordings of one historian. Although he was not a fundamentalist who opposed evolution primarily on theological grounds, he did have conservative religious instincts, and when his political fortunes declined, he adopted the cause of anti-evolution. In 1920, he began attacking evolution seriously, including at various college campuses. 2 years later, at the University of Wisconsin, he caused an uproar when he denounced evolution. The president of the University of Wisconsin was furious, and they had harsh words for each other for over a year. He wrote, Brian wrote anti-evolution articles for the New York Times and various other publications. Now, fast forward to 1925. At the Scopes trial, the defense did not care to prove Scopes' innocence. It looked forward to appealing a guilty verdict to the Supreme Court. So the ACLU was looking for bigger game. It was looking for this whole case eventually landing in the lap of the Supreme Court. The showdown between Brian and Darrow turned out to be a bizarre episode. Brian agreed to be questioned on the witness stand by Darrow. And Darrow had, proven his impressive skill as a defense lawyer. And he was able to expose Brian's ignorance of the Bible, and it was soon to be clear that Brian was not a Bible literalist. On the stand, Brian stumbled with his words and thoughts, and what came out of this, in essence, some argue, was the cause of fundamentalism had experienced a major blow. The media portrayed the stumbling, confused Brian as the face of fundamentalism. As one commentator stated, quote, Mr. Brian was never the leader of fundamentalism, except that his prominence caused the papers to count him the leader. Now, the jury did find Scopes guilty, and he did receive a fine of $100. Because only the jury could assign a sentence beyond $50, the Tennessee Supreme Court threw the case out. Foiled by this technicality, the evolution evolutionists were upset because, again, they wanted this case to go all the way up the chain. However, the liberal media turned the episode into a victory for modernism. Subsequent accounts, quote, included distortions of the events by assuming that Scopes was a biology teacher, which he wasn't, that the town of Dayton was backward, and it was a typical American city, and it was thoroughly anti-evolutionist, and that Brian's death directly resulted from the trial. These were distortions. Brian actually had been quite ill. He was not a healthy man when he chose to take this case. In any event, we have the media putting its spin on what unfolded. And what we see here is this increases. This doesn't stop here with the media. We see in popular culture this interpretation continues. For example, in the 1955 Broadway production of Inherent the Wind, this built on myths that the case represented a battle of light versus dark. More specific, the myth that the case more specific, the myth that, quote, the new conquered the old, modernity conquered fundamentalism, and the underdog triumphs, end of quote. And basically what we have here is the notion, the perception that a young, modern Scopes, with the aid of an urban lawyer, had defeated outdated conservative forces. In fact, in many newspaper accounts, Scopes emerged as, quote, a young, shy, incorruptible hero of American free thinkers. A man defending his beliefs in the face of a hostile, anti-evolutionist climate. The press created the image that he did not seek the limelight and that he was bewildered by the attention the trial had received. The New York Times reported that the virtuous Scopes turned down offers that added up to $150,000. Well, all of this was distortion. And the issue, the point of the claim of there being $150,000, that was totally false. There was no such offers. In contrast, we see that Brian was old and absurd. George Bernard Shaw wrote, quote, that people who no conception of evolution have no future, no hope, end of quote. For him, fundamentalism was infantilism. The media portrayed Dayton as home to religious fanatics, to ignorant and, quote, backward people. Darwell was the brilliant agnostic. He had claimed that the Tennessee law was un-American and unconstitutional. It attempted to limit the human mind's inquiry after truth. Quote, since the end of the Scopes trial, advocates of evolution have argued that the evolutionists were victorious, end of quote. Now, an opposing and less popular interpretation is that Scopes was a foolish young man conned into a publicity stunt that goes wrong. L. Marlon Woods writes that Scopes, quote, enters the trial to aid money grubbing, enterprising boosters willing to sacrifice their community's reputation and the fate of a young man to make cash. Darrow comes to Dayton to end democracy and force upon the people of Tennessee ideas that they consider foreign, dangerous, and subversive. End of quote. So-called sophisticated lawyers and journalists had won the day for modernism. Historian George Marsden writes that, quote, it would be difficult, sorry about that. George Marsden writes that, quote, it would be difficult to overestimate the impact of the monkey trial at Dayton, Tennessee in transforming fundamentalism. End of quote. But was fundamentalism transformed? Fundamentalists continued to believe in the fundamentals of Christianity, including the inerrancy of the Bible. They believed that the Bible from cover to cover was authored by God. What did change was that liberals became confident that a literal reading of the Bible had no standing in the modern world. It was easier to make this point when the media made, quote, fundamentalism synonymous with rural backwardness, end of quote. Thank you.